She slid the folder across the conference table without looking at me. Not a word. Not even a glance. Just the sound of paper on polished wood, and the faint smell of the coffee that had gone cold in my cup an hour ago. I looked down at the cover page. My name was printed at the top, followed by hers, followed by words I had read before in other people's lives, but never expected to see attached to mine. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The 12 people sitting around that table had all gone very still. I picked up the folder. I set it beside my notepad. And then I folded my hands and looked at my daughter-in-law, who was standing at the head of the table in the suit I had helped her buy 6 years ago for her first board presentation. And I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because I was pretending. I smiled because I had known this moment was coming for longer than she realized. And because by the time the sun went down that evening, she would understand exactly what she had just done. My name is Walter Greer. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a civil engineering consulting firm from a spare bedroom in our house in Columbus, Ohio, into one of the most respected infrastructure advisory companies in the Midwest. I did not do it alone. My wife Margaret was beside me for the first 22 of those years, until the cancer took her in the spring, 7 years ago. After that, I did it with the help of my son Daniel. And eventually with a woman Daniel brought home one Sunday afternoon and introduced as the person he intended to marry. Her name was Claire. She was 34 at the time, sharp as a whittled blade, with a way of listening to a room that made you feel she was cataloging everything for future use. I liked her immediately. I trusted her instincts. When she asked to join the firm 2 years into her marriage with Daniel, I said yes without hesitation. That was my first mistake, though I did not know it then. The second mistake came 4 years later, when I agreed to restructure my ownership stake to bring her formally onto the leadership team. Daniel had asked me. Claire had presented a compelling case about succession planning and tax efficiency. My attorney, a cautious man named Harold, who had been warning me about things I did not want to hear for 30 years, told me to slow down and read every page carefully. I read them. I signed them. I believed that family meant the same thing to everyone at that table, that it meant to me. I was wrong about that. The truth is, I began to feel the shift before I could name it. It started small. The way these things always do. A meeting I was not included in, a client call that Claire handled directly without looping me in afterward, a strategy memo that circulated to the senior team with my name conspicuously absent from the distribution list. I told myself it was growing pains. Claire was ambitious. That was not a flaw. I had been ambitious too. Once. And ambition was what had built everything around us. I told myself that stepping back was wisdom, not weakness. I was 61. I had been thinking about transition for years, but there is a difference between stepping back and being pushed. The pushing began in earnest about 18 months before that conference room morning. Claire started referring to the firm in interviews as if it had been her project all along. Not lying. Exactly. She was careful about that, but curating, selecting which parts of the story to emphasize and which parts to allow the listener to assume away. The founding years, my years, became background noise in her telling. The firm's reputation, which I had spent 3 decades building one relationship at a time, became the launching pad for the narrative she was constructing about herself. I noticed. I said nothing. Daniel noticed too, I think. But Daniel loved his wife. And Daniel had a talent for finding the most generous possible interpretation of any situation. He would say Claire was just energetic. He would say I was being sensitive. He would say these things with such genuine warmth that I never had the heart to press the point. So I watched. I kept quiet. And I paid attention in the way that a man my age has learned to pay attention, not with urgency, but with patience. The way you watch weather coming in off the lake. You do not run. You simply note the direction of the clouds and you make sure the windows are shut before you go to bed. The morning of the board meeting, I drove myself to the office as I always did. I arrived early. I made coffee in the small kitchen off the main hallway, in the same kitchen where I had stood 31 years ago on the first day this space was ours. A little terrified and entirely certain we were going to build something worth building. The board members arrived one by one. These were people I had known for years, some of them for decades. Gerald Marsh, who had been our outside counsel since the beginning. Patricio Cafor, who joined the board 6 years ago and brought with her a clarity of judgment I had always admired. 4 others, each of whom I had chosen personally, each of whom had at some point sat in my home and eaten food I had cooked and talked with me long past midnight about what kind of company we wanted to be. Claire arrived last. She walked in with the particular confidence of someone who had already decided how the day would go. She set her materials at the head of the table, my seat, the one I had occupied at every board meeting for 3 decades. The one I had quietly stopped claiming in the past year because it seemed to matter so much more to her than it did to me. She opened with a presentation. It was polished. I will give her that. Charts, projections, a 5-year growth plan that was genuinely impressive. She spoke for 40 minutes without a stumble. The board asked questions. She answered them cleanly. And then, when the formal business had concluded and the room had settled into the particular quiet that comes at the end of a long agenda, she picked up the folder. She slid it across the table to me, and she said, without raising her voice, without any particular emotion, the way you might announce a weather delay, Walter, I think it's time we formalized a few things. I have thought many times since that day about what she expected my reaction to be. I think she expected me to be stunned, or perhaps to be angry, to raise my voice, to make myself look unreasonable in front of 12 witnesses. I think she expected me to become, in that moment, exactly the obstacle she had been quietly describing me as in conversations I was not supposed to know about. I knew about them. Gerald caught my eye from across the table. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to understand that he was not entirely surprised, and that he had things to tell me that he had not yet found the right moment to say. I nodded at him slightly. He looked away. I picked up the folder. I read the first 3 pages with the same attention I give any document someone presents to me, which is to say, I read them completely and carefully and without performing any reaction for the benefit of the room. The petition was straightforward. Claire was filing for divorce from Daniel on grounds of irreconcilable differences. That part was between them, and my heart ached for my son in a way that had nothing to do with business. But the second document was addressed to me directly. It was a formal notice of her intent to exercise a buyout clause, one of the provisions from the restructuring agreement I had signed 4 years ago to acquire my remaining ownership stake in the firm at a valuation she had commissioned, independently, from a firm I had never heard of, which had arrived at a number that was, to put it plainly, an insult. She intended to own the company. She intended to remove me from the board, and she intended to do it all at once. In a single morning, in front of witnesses. Before I had time to react, it was ruthless. I will admit that part of me, the part that had built a company from nothing and fought for every contract and client relationship over 31 years, felt a cold, distant admiration for the audacity of it. Only a part of me. Though, I set the folder down. I looked at Claire. She was watching me with the careful expression of someone who has rehearsed for many possible reactions and is waiting to see which script to activate. I smiled. Not a large smile. Just the one I had been wearing for the past 14 months. Since the afternoon, I had sat in Harold's office and told him everything I had observed, and Harold had leaned back in his chair and said, Walter, I think it's time we had a very specific kind of conversation. That conversation had lasted 4 hours. The ones that followed had lasted considerably longer. I said, Claire, before we discuss the documents, I wonder if we might review something together. I reached into the leather portfolio I had carried into every board meeting for the past decade. I removed a single folder. thinner than hers, and I slid it to the center of the table. Gerald reached for it first. What the folder contained was not complicated, but it required some explanation. And I gave that explanation in the same measured tone I had always used in board meetings, the tone Margaret used to tease me about, the one she called my talking to the river voice. Because it was the voice of a man who knew the river was going to do what it was going to do, regardless of how loudly you shouted at it. 14 months earlier, acting on advice from Harold and from a forensic accountant named Susan Cho, who came highly recommended and turned out to be worth every dollar, I had conducted a thorough review of the firm's asset structure. What that review revealed was something I had not put there and had not known was there, which is to say, something Claire had arranged without my knowledge. A series of client relationships, specifically a cluster of 12 long-term infrastructure contracts that together represented approximately 60% of the firm's annual recurring revenue, had been quietly migrated over the previous 3 years into a separate service entity that Claire had established. The entity was structured in such a way that if she acquired my stake and assumed full control of the firm's parent company, the contracts and the revenue would remain with the subsidiary, which she controlled independently. She had not stolen them. Everything was technically documented, but the documentation was buried in a reorganization memo from 2 years ago that I had signed without understanding its full implications. Because it had been presented to me as a routine administrative update during a week when I was managing a family health situation and admittedly not at my most attentive. Harold's word for what she had done was constructive diversion. The courts, he told me, would likely use different language. Susan Cho's word was simpler. She called it a problem. The room was very quiet while Gerald read. Claire's expression had not changed. She was good at that, but I watched her hands, and her hands had gone very still in the particular way that hands go still when their owner is working very hard to decide what to say next. Patrice spoke first. She asked a question, a precise, technical question about the subsidiary's registration date that told me she understood immediately what she was looking at. I answered her question. Claire said, "This is being taken out of context." Gerald looked up from the folder. He had been our outside counsel for 3 decades. He had seen many things taken out of context, and many things that were exactly what they appeared to be. And his expression communicated clearly which category he believed this fell into. He said, "Claire, I think we need to pause this meeting." She said, "I disagree. The buyout provision is valid. The valuation is," he said. "Claire." She stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely. The way water fills a space, finding every corner, leaving no air. I said, "There's one more thing in the folder." The last document was a letter, not a legal document, a letter I had written myself, by hand, on the same yellow legal pad I had been using for notes since 1991. I had written it 2 weeks before the board meeting, on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table in the house where I had lived for 27 years and where Margaret and I had raised Daniel, and where I had, more than once, imagined growing old. With a measure of peace, the letter was addressed to the board, but it was really addressed to Claire. I had known she would be in the room to hear it. It said, in part, that I had spent 31 years building something I believed in, that I had made many decisions in those years, some excellent and some I regretted, that I had extended trust generously, sometimes unwisely, that I had watched the company I built be slowly reframed as something other than what it was, and had stayed quiet because I did not want to believe what I was seeing. It said that I was not angry. That part was true. I had been angry. Earlier in the process, in those first weeks after Harold and Susan had shown me what the documents actually said, when I had driven home in the dark and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes because I did not want to bring whatever I was feeling into the house, I had been angry then, but anger at my age is a short-term fuel. It burns fast and leaves you cold. What had replaced it was something else. Something quieter. The kind of clarity that only comes, I think, when you have decided you are done pretending. The letters said that I was prepared to support a full independent audit, that I was prepared to let the courts sort out the subsidiary question, that I was prepared. If that was what Daniel wanted, to let the marriage end with the least possible damage to everyone involved, and that my concern for my son's well-being was entirely separate from and would not be compromised by any business dispute, and it said that I was also prepared to do none of those things. If Claire preferred to have a different kind of conversation, a conversation about what the firm actually was, how it had been built, who had built it, and what a fair and honest accounting of that history might look like. I said all of this without raising my voice. When I finished, I folded my hands on the table the same way I had folded them when she slid that first folder across to me, and I said, "I'll wait." Gerald called a recess. In the hallway, Patrice touched my arm briefly as she passed and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. I stood at the window that looked out over the parking lot and the row of elms I had planted when we moved into this building, which were now tall enough to cast real shade, and I thought about Margaret. She had always known, not about Claire, she never met Claire, but about me. She knew the thing in me that sometimes made me stay quiet too long, that let things build until there was no avoiding them, that preferred patience over confrontation, even when confrontation would have been faster and probably kinder. She would have told me to say something sooner. She would have been right. But she also would have understood why I hadn't. She was the only person who ever fully understood both things about me at the same time. And I missed her for that most specifically, standing in that hallway, more than I had in a while. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When the board reconvened, Claire's attorney, who had apparently been waiting in a car in the parking lot, which told me something about how carefully this morning had been planned, joined the meeting. There was a conversation that I will not detail here because most of it was legal and procedural, and the specifics matter less than what it amounted to. What it amounted to was this: the buyout clause, as written, was contingent on a clean audit of the firm's full asset structure. The independent valuation Claire had commissioned had been based on financial statements that did not include the subsidiary's revenue in any meaningful way. A proper valuation, conducted with full transparency, would produce a number that was substantially different and that would require substantially different terms. Her attorney knew this. She could see it in the way he spoke to her. Quietly, with the careful tone of a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath the plan was not as solid as advertised. Claire looked at me once during that conversation. Just once. For a long moment, I do not know what she was looking for. I do not know if she found it. I looked back at her and thought about the Sunday she and Daniel had driven up to the house for his birthday 3 years ago. And she had helped me plant the last of the fall bulbs along the fence line, because Daniel's back was bothering him and I hadn't wanted to ask anyone else. We had worked for 2 hours in the late afternoon light, mostly in silence. And it had been a good silence. The kind I associate with people who do not need to fill every moment with proof that they exist. I had thought, that afternoon, that she was someone I could trust. I had not been entirely wrong. I had simply not understood what she trusted herself to do. The divorce between Daniel and Claire was finalized 7 months later. It was difficult. Daniel is a gentleman, and gentlemen suffer quietly in ways that are hard to watch from the outside. I drove to Cincinnati, where he was living by then, every other weekend for most of that year. We did not always talk about what had happened. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we watched whatever was on and said very little. That was enough. That is what fathers are for. The firm's situation resolved more slowly and more expensively than I would have preferred. But it resolved. The subsidiary was reintegrated. The audit concluded what Harold and Susan had predicted it would conclude. Claire departed the company with a settlement that her attorney negotiated down from her initial position in ways I found satisfying. though I tried not to dwell on that too long, because satisfaction in another person's loss is not a quality I want to cultivate in myself at this stage of life. She moved to Portland. I heard she started a smaller firm of her own. I do not know if it is doing well, and I find that I genuinely do not care either way, which feels like a healthier relationship to the whole thing than I had expected to achieve. There is something people often get wrong about quiet men. They assume that quiet means passive. That patience means surrender. That the man who does not raise his voice in a difficult room is the man who has run out of things to say. I have been quiet most of my life. Margaret teased me about it. My employees occasionally found it unnerving. More than one client, over the years, misread it as uncertainty and thought they could push me further than I was willing to go. They always discovered their mistake eventually. Quietness is not the absence of strength. It is the decision to hold strength in reserve until the moment it is actually needed. It is the understanding, which takes most of a lifetime to arrive at, that very few moments actually require you to be loud. The morning in that conference room required me to be quiet, to sit still while someone tried to dismantle everything I had built, and to respond not with anger, not with spectacle, but with a folder thinner than hers and a letter I had written in longhand on a Sunday morning. That was enough. It has always been enough. Daniel called me on a Thursday evening, about a year after everything had settled. He had met someone, he said, a woman named Ruth, a librarian from Dayton, who apparently shared his taste for old westerns and elaborate pasta dishes made from scratch. He sounded like himself again. I sat on the back porch after we hung up and watched the sun go down over the yard and thought about the elms in the parking lot and the bulbs along the fence line and all the things that grow slowly and quietly and turn out, in the end, to be stronger than anything you planted in a hurry. Margaret would have liked Ruth. I am almost certain of that. I look forward to finding out.